Hi, this is Scott Garibay, and today I'm going to be talking specifically about Dungeons & Dragons history, year number 5, the 5th year of Dungeons & Dragons history, 1978. And here we're looking at Dungeons & Dragons history specifically in the late 70s, and we're looking at it through the filter of clear: catalyst, location, entity, artifact, and relationship. So what was the primary catalyst in 1978 for Dungeons & Dragons? Well, that was a gentleman by the name of James M. Ward. And James M. Ward created Gamma World, okay? So in 1975, we had seen Boot Hill, which was was one of the very, very early tabletop role-playing games that was created by TSR after Dungeons & Dragons. And here we see, only in the 5th year, there's a brand new world being created with the Dungeons & Dragons rules. Similar, the similar structure, using the polyhedral dice, using the same box set format. Gamma World comes out and is even more solidifying that not only is Dungeons & Dragons going to be able to sell a lot of content on its own, but that the structure of tabletop role-playing game overall is incredibly versatile, and that there's almost limitless worlds that can be created using the Dungeons & Dragons rule set. And so this is really exciting, and not only is Gamma World going to bolster the sales of TSR, giving them more courage to create more products and continue to spread Dungeons & Dragons, but additionally it's going to give other tabletop role-playing games tabletop role-playing game companies and creators confidence that they can move forward and create their own games based on tabletop role-playing game principles. And this isn't a small thing, it's a really big thing. So even in the 5th year of Dungeons & Dragons, we're seeing large-scale, exciting new worlds that are being created as distinct core rule books, distinct tabletop role-playing games that stand alone and separate from Dungeons & Dragons, but are really being fired and ignited by the incredible excitement that is beginning to build around Dungeons & Dragons. And if you look back, you can really see that in that from the very beginning, Dungeons & Dragons was really, in many ways, on rails. Once people saw what it was and started to get the concept, its growth was explosive, and in many ways it would be on rails. It would continue to move forward, not from a lack of obstacles, but even despite the obstacles that would be thrown in front of it, for a long time. I would really even say until 4th edition, Dungeons & Dragons momentum is incredibly straightforward and continues to just grow like gangbusters, right? All right. Let's talk about location. So here under location in 1978, we're talking about London, England. So the game Dungeons & Dragons is starting to be played in London, England. It is showing up in force in Europe, okay? And you're seeing it in a lot of European countries: Germany, France, England, and it really is. And even in year number 5, it is becoming very evident that Dungeons & Dragons is going to be a global IP, a global intellectual property, and it really, and one of the reasons why is, again, there's really nothing like Dungeons & Dragons. It truly is unique. Let's talk about entity, right? Like the non-player character of 1978, and that is Jimmy Carter. So Jimmy Carter comes in as the president for 1978. The country is hoping that we're going to get back on track. There was just a massive disruption of United States politics with Richard Nixon, and then kind of a placeholder president with Gerald Ford, president who was in office but was never elected to office, to the presidency. Very, very unusual, right, circumstance. And now Jimmy Carter comes in. Jimmy Carter is a brilliant politician. He's a peanut farmer. He comes in as a Democrat. And and people are, and actually, I think Jimmy Carter was a really brilliant politician. Really, in many ways, a great man to take on the role of presidency, but almost everything he tried failed. So we're dealing with in the late 70s, we're dealing with massive gas shortages, and many of his policies he comes off looking weak to the people, to the United States of American people, setting him up for a swift defeat in the 80s. And he would serve only one term. So Jimmy Carter would only be in for a single term and would be knocked out of his position very, very quickly. But Jimmy Carter's taking on the role of presidency in 1978 again shapes the world that Dungeons and Dragons is growing in, right? Dungeons and Dragons really affects our politics, our culture, and our society, and our politics and our culture and our society affect Dungeons and Dragons, right? All right, the artifact. So the artifact is very, very important. Here in 1978, we see the 1E Player's Handbook, the first edition Player's Handbook. So 1E PHB is the artifact for 1978. So this is an incredibly important artifact. It's arguably the most important artifact we've seen so far, in that the 1E PHB is incredibly important because the first edition Player's Handbook is incredibly important, specifically because what we see with this book is the eternal format, right? The eternal format for Dungeons and Dragons, and that is a hardback book. It's a little bigger than an 8.5 by 11 piece of paper, but it's generally that shape. It's rectangular. It's between 150 200 pages long, right? And it is a hardback book with hundreds of pages. Right? It's well over 150 pages long, and there's so much to be said about this because this locks in what would be the format to this very day till 2019. So the 1E PHB locks in the format for what is considered the preeminent Dungeons and Dragons product. When people think about Dungeons and Dragons, they will think about the hardback, hundreds of pages rule book, okay? It will be what will define Dungeons and Dragons. And also, not only is it hundreds of pages long, right? I think it's well over 150, but going forward, books will come in at around 200 to 300 pages for virtually every single edition. That number will be essentially locked in, right? What you will see is also it is the Player's Handbook. And this is a huge statement to everyone out there. They're saying, this is the book that just teaches a player how to play this game. So up to this point, we've been dealing with box sets, right? And box sets are beautiful because they're simple and they're concise, and you can hand it over, and a group has everything they need to play the game, right? But this is an increase in complexity. It's saying this 150 pages plus of content is just for the player, and there will be, and it's also a declaration that there's a book coming for the DMG, right, which we'll talk about in a later year. But it's saying, hey, just the player needs this, and so it is a declaration that Dungeons and Dragons is a complex game and will remain a complex game for the entirety of its entire run, and that this game has complexity to it. And while it will allow you to build worlds, it's not going to be an easy road, right? Like, you're going to have to read hundreds of pages, and also there is going to be this is the 1E PHB is the first declaration of the importance of system mastery, that you will need to master the systems contained within Dungeons and Dragons, and that Dungeons and Dragons can move far beyond the core four, the wizard, the fighter, the rogue, and the cleric, right? And that there are going to be lots of different there are actually very much going to be lots of different character races. There's going to be lots of different character classes, and also the 1E PHB is kind of the big stamp that gives Gary Gygax what he wants, which is he wants a very detailed. Gary Gygax wants an incredibly detailed, thorough system. He wants there to be falling rules. He wants there to be for players to know how far it will take, how far they can travel by foot in a day, how far they can travel by horse in a day. The 1E PHP is the start of a very, very specific simulation aspect of tabletop role-playing games, where we're saying, okay, if I shoot you with an arrow, how much of your life is that going to take, right? Bleeding rules, all kinds of different aspects of simulation are presented within the 1E PHP. So the 1E, the first edition Player's Handbook, is an incredibly important artifact because it locks in the format. And to this very day, that hundreds page long, hardback, a little more bigger than an 8.5 by 11 piece of paper, is locked in. It's locked in as the preeminent format for Dungeons & Dragons. And it also starts the core three, right? The PHP, the DMG, the Monster Manual. Again, a division of knowledge that will exist for every single edition of Dungeons & Dragons. So the 1E PHP locks in many aspects of Dungeons & Dragons that will become simply building blocks of what not only Dungeons & Dragons are, but the vast majority of tabletop role-playing games will follow Dungeons & Dragons in these traditions. The 1E PHP is a tradition setter. It is an absolutely powerful tradition setter. Okay, last is the relationship. So what is the relationship that we see in 1978 for Dungeons & Dragons? Well, Dungeons & Dragons has a relationship to copyright. All right, now it's 1978, and we see a relationship to copyright starting to form with Dungeons & Dragons. And the reason we see that is there was a Copyright Act of 1976 which changed copyright in very, very important ways for all of America, right? Well, here we see with the Copyright Act of 1976, the changes that were implemented by that law don't get put into effect until 1978, right? And Dungeons & Dragons will have a very unusual relationship with copyright for the entirety of it, for all the days of its existence, right? Or all the way up until now, 2019. So here, early in the days of Dungeons & Dragons, there were issues about copyright laws as far as could Cthulhu be added to the Monster Manual, things like that, right? And so for all the days of its existence, Dungeons & Dragons would have to be careful about copyright. And the reason why is copyright, what monsters can go into the game, what character classes can be used, what titles can be used for the character classes. When someone creates, when a creator creates content for Dungeons & Dragons, what ownership do they have of that content that's going into the book with other content, right? And so Dungeons & Dragons, because of its complexity, because of its new shape, here's something that's art and a game and a book, right? Like it challenges copyright in ways that we've never seen before. It does that to this very day. Yesterday on Twitter, I saw someone ask a question of, hey, who owns the copyright on a character used in a stream? So perfect example would be Matt Mercer's game, right? There are millions of people watching that game. It's a Dungeons & Dragons game. Matt Mercer is the DM, but the players play the player characters. Does the player who plays the player character own the copyright to that material for that character? It's a really good question. Is it shared between the player and the DMG, or is it shared between the player, the DMG? The DM, the Dungeon Master. Is it played between the player and the Dungeon Master, or is it shared between the player, the Dungeon Master, and Wizards of the Coast? We don't really know the answers to those questions yet, right? We're literally on the frontier of that question. So right there in 1978, where with the changes from the copyright law of 1976 coming into effect in 1978, Dungeons & Dragons begins its long and complicated relationship with copyright. So that is a clear history of Dungeons & Dragons Year 5 history, Year 5, 1978. Thank you very much.